Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to Sunday Albums. It's Kuroda here again. I'm really excited about today's review because it's going to be an album by one of my favorite bands of all time, and that band is King Crimson, as you guys probably see in the title. And the album is Discipline by King Crimson. This is one of their best albums, in my opinion. I absolutely love this album. This is their eighth studio album, which is probably you're probably thinking like, especially any of you who know who King Crimson is, why wouldn't you review the first album first? Because it actually is their most famous album, and it's their first record. Reason for that being is that this album is an album I've been listening to a lot lately, and this is actually my copy of the album. My wife does not own this album, although I'm sure she's pretty jealous that actually I own this album. She'd like to own this album because I recently actually got her into this album. So this is also a very, very different sounding album than anything that came before it by this band. And yeah, I'm just really excited about it. I've been listening to this one a lot. Lately, I've really loved this album for a long time. And it was one of those albums that when I first discovered King Crimson, I didn't jump on this immediately. In fact, it took a couple years before I heard this one. I couldn't even say really where I heard of it. I think it was just one of those albums where it was just like, it was a King Crimson album. I figured I'd give it a shot. So, but I do remember this one, my first impressions of this album being, wow, this is way different than anything they've recorded, but it's also really good. The album came out in 1981 and features an all-new lineup of King Crimson. If anybody knows King Crimson at all, you know that the lineup of the band was constantly changing. In fact, up until this album, there had never been a King Crimson album released before that with the same lineup as before. In contrast, this started a trilogy of albums in the 80s that featured the same lineup, same four guys. And the four guys who were in the band at this point were two veterans of the band, Robert Fripp, who is the basically the main guy in the band, who is still in the band and has been there since the beginning. So he's been the only consistent member of the band in its 50-year history almost. Yeah, almost 50 years. I think 48, I think. First album came out in like 69, so roughly about 50 years. He's been the only consistent member, and there's been tons and tons of lineup changes. But it's, of course, Robert Fripp on guitar. I believe he also plays, it says "and devices" on the back of this. I'll show you the back of the record. There's not much. And devices. So, like, usually some kind of keyboard or some kind of electronic thing that he's doing, but he mostly does, he's mostly a guitar player. Adrian Belew, who's a newcomer of the band, also plays guitar and sings all the lead vocals and writes all the lyrics. Bill Bruford is the other veteran of the band, who was in the three albums before this that were released from 73 to 74, and amazing drummer, unbelievable drummer. And Tony Levin is also the other newcomer, although Robert Fripp worked with him before this album on other albums he collaborated with guys like Peter Gabriel comes to mind. I think he worked with Eno as well, Brian Eno, but I have to double check that. I'll put it in the video right here if that is the case. But Fripp did work with Tony Levin before this. Adrian Belew originally was actually discovered by Frank Zappa, was in his band for a short bit, and then also played with David Bowie and the Talking Heads. And Robert Fripp did a bunch of session work for David Bowie and plays on a little song some of you guys might have heard of before called "Heroes" by David Bowie. Also played on the Scary Monsters album. I mean, Fripp did a lot of stuff. He did, like I said, stuff with Peter Gabriel. He did solo albums. This was from the time uh, after King Crimson originally broke up in 1974 until this album actually came out in 1981. And funny thing about this, originally the band wasn't even supposed to be named King Crimson when they recorded this album. They were actually originally called Discipline, actually, and they decided to go with the name King Crimson and the name of the album being Discipline. So the first tour I think they did as under the name Discipline, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, Fripp did a lot of session work, worked with David Bowie. I believe it was on David Bowie's recommendation that Fripp seek out Adrian Belew to actually work with him on this album. And I think it should also be noted that if anybody knows of the band Talking Heads, they were kind of a very popular new wave pop kind of group from the 80s. He did a lot of work with the Talking Heads before joining King Crimson as well. So Adrian Belew has been around. I mean, 3 huge names: Zappa, Bowie, Talking Heads. I mean, the guy worked with some amazing musicians before he joined King Crimson. This record, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the history of King Crimson before I get right into this quite yet, because I think if you don't know King Crimson, you should know kind of how they sound. They're considered progressive rock. They're usually long songs, very complex music, very dark and heavy kind of music, very dark lyrics, a lot of conceptual songs, a lot of different styles of music. They've incorporated everything from classical to jazz to I wouldn't say folk elements. No, that's more like Tull and stuff like that. I would say, yeah, rock and roll. They really actually, if you hear albums like Lark's Tongues and Aspic, and you hear Red, or you hear a song like 21st Century Schizoid Man off of In the Court of the Crimson King, they kind of had a proto-metalness to them. They're really influential to a lot of bands, and were considered the first progressive band in '69 because they were the first band to really use crazy time signatures, be highly technically proficient on their instruments in the rock sense. They really brought rock musicianship to a whole different level that no other band had done before them, and at least not to the level they had. But they influenced many bands like Yes, Jethro Tull, Genesis, Gentle Giant. I mean, you name a progressive rock band, more than likely they were influenced by King Crimson. Anyway, that was kind of... It's hard to say that that's their style, because even their early albums from 69 to 74, there were 7 of them. They don't really all sound the same. They all kind of have a different take, but they were more staples of progressive rock, where this album, they really took a different direction. Shorter songs. Honestly, Adrian Belew, up to that point, I think, best and most melodic singer of... except him and Greg Lake, who was on the original album, maybe, but I think he's the best singer, really, they've ever had. He just got a very, I think, a very soulful voice. Can really hold a note, whereas guys like John Wetton, I felt like was a decent singer, but really wasn't like a... I don't know, he just didn't have... I think the soulfulness that Adrian Belew has. And Adrian Belew also has a bit of a quirkiness to his voice as well, akin to David Byrne from Talking Heads, which is why I felt like it was necessary to mention that he had worked with them, because it's sort of like if... I would say that Adrian Belew's voice is like if David Byrne from the Talking Heads could sing well. You'd have Adrian Belew, because Adrian Belew really can I think is a very good singer and is a very unique guitar player. He one of the reasons he was really into Zappa's, or one of the reasons that I guess Zappa kind of was impressed with him, was because he was able to make his guitar sound like anything. Like if you listen to this album, you'll hear all kinds of strange sounds that are coming from Adrian Belew's guitar. I mean, there's a song where it almost sounds like a seagull, the sound of a seagull. There's the first track on this, Elephant Talk. He makes his guitar sound like an elephant's trunk. It's crazy, and he's kind of known for that. He really is. He innovated a lot of different sounds and ways of making sounds on the guitar, which is very, very interesting. So you have him, Tony Levin, who is Tony Levin is a master bass player. Has worked before King Crimson and since up until this day with go to Wikipedia and just look up Tony Levin. He's played with everybody. He is a very, very well respected bass player. Can play all kinds of different instruments, not just bass. He often uses a Chapman stick, which here's a picture of it right here. This is the Chapman stick. He often plays it really high up with two hands. Kind of, I'll put this down a second. Kind of like this, which is very odd for a bass player. The Chapman stick's a very interesting instrument. And has played countless other instruments. Just a real virtuoso on the bass, considered by many one of the best bass players. And then Bill Bruford, to me, is another. Like I said, was in the 3 King Crimson albums before this album. Lark's Tongues and Aspics, Starless in the Bible Black, and Red, which Red is a very, very highly regarded album as well. And also he played with Yes and a band called UK. Very, very well respected drummer. The guy's got a lot of technique, very rhythmic, but very. He is not like a keeping the beat kind of drummer. He's very much about like accents and different. He knows what to hit when. He's very, very, very good. He can be very complex, but he can also be very. I think, especially in this album, subtle, very subtle. He has a way of keeping the rhythm going, but it's not a simple rhythm. He uses very, very complex. He has these very complex patterns and ways of playing that is just unbelievable. It's very subtle, but it's very, very, very good. And of course, Robert Fripp. He is just, like I said, he's the main guy. King Crimson really is Robert Fripp. Robert Fripp has even said that King Crimson is a way of doing things. It's not really a band, because if you listen to a King Crimson album, as different as this album is, if you know King Crimson's music, you go, yeah, that's still King Crimson. It has a core King Crimson sound, very dark sounding. Honestly, these are two really weird adjectives to describe King Crimson sound, but it can be ominous, menacing, but also at times very light and subtle, actually, sometimes, believe it or not. But with this album, it was really taken in a different direction. There's a lot more. I feel like there's some pop sensibilities here, because I think this is a direct result of Fripp having broken up King Crimson in 1974 and going out, and he kind of went on a spiritual journey for a while, then moved to New York City and did all that session work with the aforementioned people that I was talking about, mostly in the pop world. I think that influenced him greatly, and he wanted to create a new band, eventually obviously becoming King Crimson, with more pop sensibilities. So while the music here still has that core kind of dark Crimson sound, and still has the complexities that is pretty much what King Crimson is identified with, and that musicianship is what I should say. It still is very, it's more, I would say, a little bit more accessible, and it's done within the format of a pop song, or a pop. I think maybe pop is slightly different. It's kind of a slightly, I don't want to say it's a dirty word here, because I don't have a problem with pop music, but to call this a pop record would definitely be wrong. It's just meant to do it in a pop format, like shorter songs. It's very 80s sounding. Like you could, like when you, the first thing, when even from the first song, when you hear it, you're gonna go, okay, this is really weird and very different, but it sounds 80s. It's very, it definitely sounds of its time, but it's not dated. It's still very fresh. It's still very different. And I think it's one of the most unique albums I've ever heard. Aside from maybe the albums by the same band here after it, Beat and Three of a Perfect Pair, which are the two other 80s albums that came after this one, there's really nothing else that sounds like this to this day, I feel. Nothing that I can think of offhand. It has a bit in common with certain new wave bands. It sounds a little like Talking Heads, but I think that's more Adrian Belew's vocals than it is actually the overall sound of King Crimson. But it's just got this unique quality about it that I can't really put to words. You have to really hear it. But if I could just go through track by track here. First side, there's a song called Elephant Talk, which the lyrics to this song are kind of strange. You couldn't even really call it. He doesn't sing. He kind of just monologues through it, and he just talks about. He just basically is saying words that would describe different ways that people talk to each other in alphabetical order. So you have to hear the song. It's very odd, but Adrian Belew does some very, very, very interesting things with the guitar in this song. It's interesting because there's two guitar players, and Fripp seems to do the more rhythmic guitar playing, but I recall seeing a interview with Bill Bruford, the drummer on this album, obviously, and he was talking about this album, and when Fripp kind of recruited him for it, Bruford's kind of a bit of a stickler with, like, he doesn't want to do the same thing, which is why he left Yes and joined King Crimson originally, but he wanted, when Fripp approached him about this, Bruford said something to the effect of, well, what's going to be different about this King Crimson? And apparently, from what I understand, the whole idea between the two, like the dynamic between Adrian Belew and Robert Fripp was there would be two guitars playing, but none of them would play chords. It would just all be notes. So the rhythm, especially in the second track, Frame by Frame, perfect example of this. You're going to hear a constant rhythm in the guitar playing, in the rhythm guitar, but it's not with chords. It's all in notes. So Fripp plays kind of like, he plays in a rhythmic way, but not with chords, which is so odd and so different. It's very interesting. And meanwhile, Belew does other things on the guitar, more of the lead stuff, but it's very subtle, and if you don't know to look for it, I think you'll miss it unless you're really big, not to sound snobby, but if you really know King Crimson's music, and if it's what you listen to in the song. So it's a very, very interesting way of doing it, and that's very, very prominent throughout this whole album. Honestly, the first side is really probably my favorite part of the whole album, and I think Rachel would agree with me there when I introduced her to it. She said that to me, that really is the more interesting side. Mate Kudasai is after that, which is one of my absolute favorite tracks on this album. First of all, Adrian Belew's vocals are fantastic on that song. Like, absolutely fantastic. And there's just some very, very interesting things happening musically there. the drums, the bass, the rhythm in this whole album is just fantastic. Like I don't know how to describe it. Bill Bruford and Tony Levin they're so tight rhythmically that it just really holds the song down. And I feel like even if you're not a person who notices the bass and drums, because they're often overlooked, you will on this album, because it's just so, I feel, on the forefront, and so pieces the music together that it's really hard to not notice it, to be honest, and all of them, really. I mean, the music itself, there's a lot going on within the songs, but at the same time, they're all holding it together somehow. It's so interesting. Yeah, and Indiscipline is after Mate Kudasai, and this is probably the heaviest piece on the album. That song is probably the most King Crimson-esque tune on the whole album, because it's got that heavy, just that heavy tone to it. Some very classic Fripp leads, I feel, in that tune. But it's an odd song because, again, Blue doesn't sing, he just monologues again, and he says, like, the lines in the song are like, I carried it around with me for days and days, playing little games, like not holding or not looking at it for a whole day, and then looking at it to see if I still liked it. I did, and then all of a sudden the music comes in. It's like that King Crimson, like, darkness comes in. It's very, very strange and ominous, and it's at the same time very, very, I don't know, musically very interesting. The second side starts out with a song called Fela Jeet, which I believe is some kind of African language that I don't know offhand, but I honestly don't remember what language it's in, but it means heat in the jungle. The premise of the song being basically it's supposed to be about, like, New York City, or not just New York City, but, like, basically crime in, like, an urban area, right? And little story behind it is Adrian Blue was trying to record some, like, he was, like, out in the streets, and I think it was somewhere in London, bad part of the city, and he had a tape recorder, and he was, like, recording, he was just saying stuff like, he held a gun in his hand, blah, 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 and he was harassed by some thugs there on the street, and they heard that, and they basically, like, approached him and, like, what are you taping for, blah, 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 and they played the tape, and what was played back was what Blue was saying about, he held a gun in his hand, there's a dangerous place, whatever. And there's a whole story about it in the song. And basically, he went back to the studio where they were recording the album, and Fripp, he's, like, freaking out about it and telling the band about what happened to him. And Fripp, unbeknownst to Blue, recorded him telling the story, and it's in the song. It's very interesting. So the whole middle piece of the song is him telling about how he was harassed by these guys on the street, and it's just really weird. But musically in the song, there's some amazing bass in it. The bass line is fantastic in that song. It's a very danceable song, I would say, if there was one actual danceable song. I don't know if you could say that, but I could dance to that song anyway. And the drums are unbelievable in that song. It's very, it sounds kind of like African world kind of type sound. Very, like, how do I want to say? Very, like, see, I'm not a drummer. I don't know drum terms, very much like how you would hear somebody in world music play, like, kind of like a, like, imagine like hearing like a guy on the congas or the bongos playing, but on an actual drum kit. It's pretty great, pretty solid rhythm in that too. And then the last two Songs are great too, both instrumental. Again, great musicianship. I really like the song "The Sheltering Sky." That one's really great. There's some really interesting guitar work done in there by Robert Fripp. That's very kind of like dark and odd, you know. But overall, I don't know. I would say the whole album is I would say Discipline, the last track on the album for me, is the weakest one, although I still like it. It's just that I think it was a bad idea to put two instrumentals in a row at the back end of the album. I think they should have put maybe Discipline up, maybe on the first side or something, and brought one of the other ones down, because it's to me it kind of, towards the end of the album, you're kind of, it's the most forgettable track, I would say, although it's still really good. It's very, very good. So I would say it's still good, but kind of like, I don't know, the album doesn't quite end on as good of a note as it does as it starts. The second side is certainly a lot better, but the first side is certainly a lot better, but the second side is great too. It's just, I wish it ended a little stronger, is what I guess I want to say. But I guess for me, and I just want to read this random line here on the back of the. See, there isn't much on the back, as I showed you guys before, but this line at the very bottom. I mean, I could pretend that I'm just this well-versed, like, smart, guy, but I'm not going to. I really don't get it, but it just says, "Discipline is never an end in itself, only a means to an end." I'm not so sure what that's supposed to mean. Robert Fripp is a really weird dude, and yeah, discipline is never an end in itself, only a means to an end. Yeah, I don't know. That's probably something deep, but I don't really get it. But I'll just skip to Final Thoughts. Final Thoughts, I love this album. It's one of the most unique albums I've ever heard. Not just one of the most unique King Crimson albums, although it definitely is. I love the musicians in this band. It's one of the best incarnations of King Crimson, in my opinion. Honestly, rivaled only with maybe the original lineup. Yeah, I think I could honestly make that statement. Yeah, probably rivaled only with, because this lineup actually ended up doing, like I said, the two albums after it, and then joined by two other musicians. The album Thrack in the 90s, before Bill Bruford left. And really the most long-standing lineup of any King Crimson lineup, which is quite a statement. And I don't know, this album's just so good. If you guys really want to hear something different, give this one a shot. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. This is as far as King Crimson's albums go, it's definitely one of the more accessible ones, and it's one of the most interesting. So out of a 10, I want to give it a 10 out of 10. It's not my favorite King Crimson album. It's certainly up there, top 3, most definitely, possibly top 2, I don't know. But I'd give it somewhere between, maybe because it doesn't quite end as strongly as it begins, I'd give it maybe a 9 out of 10, 9.5 maybe out of 10. Almost a 10, not quite there. It's not in the Court of the Crimson King to me. It's not quite Red either. It's on that level, but I'll give it like a 9.5 out of 10. So it's really great. I highly recommend it. If you haven't heard it, listen to this album. Don't let this, though, be your first King Crimson album. I would say at least listen to Court of the Crimson King and Red first, but listen to this one for sure. This is definitely interesting. And if you don't like King Crimson, or Court of the Crimson King or Red, listen to this one anyway, because it might be different enough that you might like it. Because I know Rachel likes she's liked pretty much every King Crimson album I've played for her, but I know this one really stood out to her. So and it has for other people that I've introduced it to. So I really highly recommend this album. It's one of my absolute favorite albums of all time. Probably top 5 albums of the 80s for me, without question. Without question. It's really good. And As far as art rock, new wave kind of thing, it's probably the best thing that I think that's come out of that movement. So, ironically, by a veteran progressive rock band, but what are you gonna do? But okay, that's it for this. So, thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Next Sunday will be Christmas Eve, so I haven't decided if I'm going to have an album review out or not. Maybe I'll try to do something Christmassy, even though I don't really like Christmas music, but I could always try to listen to something this week to get me in the old Christmas spirit, and I could review something for you guys, or something totally different. Or if you guys want me to review something, leave me a comment and let me know what you want me to listen to. But until then, I will see you guys next week. Till then, peace.